another in a series of programs sponsored by Woods and Wetlands group of the Illinois Sierra Club. My name is Linda Tilton, and I will be your host this evening. Our programs feature speakers on topics relating to our environment, stewardship, wildlife and nature, public policy, and anything about outdoor activities like hiking, canoeing, kayaking, and bird watching. In a minute, we will hear from our featured speaker for October, Dr. Dana Garrigan of Carthage College, who will share information on the story of the Chiwaukee Prairie. But first, we have a couple of very brief announcements. As Doug said, we are recording this so that you can watch it in the future. Turn off your camera if you don't wish to appear on the video. We will send you the YouTube address for the program later this week, and you'll be able to access it on our YouTube channel. Before we begin, please make sure you are muted, especially if you have a barking dog, television, or other commotion in the background. Please feel free to ask questions of our speaker this evening by using the chat room at the bottom of the screen. We will select the questions afterwards and we'll present them to Dana after his talk. Now let's move on to our October featured speaker. Dr. Dana Garrigan has an infectious enthusiasm for nature. As a professor of biology at Carthage College, he teaches courses on ecology, conservation biology, entomology, climate change, and evolution. His research has focused primarily on plants and insects and has been funded by grants from private foundations, the National Science Foundation, the National Park Service, and NASA. Dana also has a passion for photography, and he occasionally teaches a field-based nature photography course at Carthage. His expertise in biology, photography, and education were recently brought together in a special exhibit at the Kenosha Public Museum titled Chiwaukee Prairie, a Photojournal of Preservation. In his presentation tonight, he'll share some of those photos and others to introduce this unique and valuable remnant prairie along the shore of Lake Michigan and the people who work to preserve it. We welcome you, Dana. You have the controls.
All right. Well, thank you and welcome, everyone. Appreciate you being here on Sunday night. It's hard to compete with the NFL, but I appreciate your interest in the prairie and look forward to sharing residents of the prairie with you. I did want to check back with Doug. You had mentioned that we couldn't put up the screen because you couldn't see anything. Want to make sure that you got done everything you needed to do before we launch into the presentation.
Yeah, it's all good.
All right. Yeah. Thank you. Then we'll go ahead and start. I'm going to be talking about the history of Chiwaukee Prairie Preservation, as well as the natural history of the prairie and some of the residents, both people who work to preserve the prairie, live in the communities around the prairie, and also the local native residents, the flora and fauna. I'll spend a little more time talking about some of these organisms than others because I have a lot of pretty pictures to show you tonight. And one of my big goals is just to give you a sense of the place, to give you sort of a virtual field trip at Chiwaukee Prairie. So we'll start here. Some of the residents that we're seeing here, these are common milkweed plants. This is a leaf of a common milkweed plant. And this is the milkweed beetle. And one of the cool things I think about the milkweed beetle, insects are just fascinating. Insects are one of the most diverse groups of organisms on the planet. They're generally defined by having 6 legs, is what makes something an insect. Exoskeleton, usually two pairs of wings. Sometimes the wings are hidden behind a thickened front pair of wings, as the case with these beetles. So we don't actually see the wings on this particular insect right now. We see them, but you wouldn't recognize them as wings. They're these thickened elytra, we call them, in the back. But one of the cool things about these beetles is they actually have divided eyes. They have a part of the compound eye up above the antenna and a part of the compound eye down below the antenna. Just again, part of the remarkable diversity that we see within insects. But let's go ahead and start our tour of Chiwaukee Prairie in the spring. This is right around Memorial Day, so late May, early June. Actually, there's been stuff happening on the prairie for a few months by that point, but this is one of the first points where you really notice the prairie comes alive. And these are shooting stars in Chiwaukee Prairie, and there are acres and acres of shooting stars, probably one of the largest shooting star populations we know of. The diversity in colors here range from almost white to sort of lavender to bright magenta pink. There are a few other species like the orange hoary puccoons in there, but most of what we're seeing in terms of the things in flower right now are shooting stars. And I start with shooting stars because shooting stars have an important relevance in terms of the conservation of the prairie. It was back in the 1960s, near Memorial Day again, Memorial Day 1961, when some local residents were driving near the prairie, Carla and Al Crampert, and noticed that this area had a profusion of native species, native prairie species, that clearly indicated it was perhaps a remnant prairie. And what we mean by remnant prairie or virgin prairie means an area that had been prairie historically and had not been plowed or otherwise disturbed. And this was really exciting to Carla and Al Crampert. And they organized an effort a little bit later to conserve the prairie that we'll talk about here in a minute. That was important because over the years, Chiwaukee Prairie had been under threat of development. And I'll say for now, I'll show you a map in a few minutes, that Chiwaukee Prairie is bordered on the east by Lake Michigan, which you can see a little bit on this map. And on the west by Sheridan Road, or Highway 32, as it's called, runs north-south in Kenosha County. And right now it runs all the way down to the Illinois state line. Of course, this is part of a larger contiguous block of habitat that runs into Illinois as well. So this is certainly an area that we share a lot in common with Northern Illinois, and we have some conservation efforts that cross the border there. So you might have seen the southern end of this natural area and called it something else. If you visited Illinois Dunes or Illinois Beach State Park or Spring Bluff Nature Preserve, you've seen a portion of this contiguous patch of land and habitat that north of the border we call Chiwaukee Prairie. But this area had been under threat of development since really the early 1900s. Back in the early 1920s, Edith Rockefeller McCormick had developed a plan to purchase and develop luxury home sites in the northern part of what's now Chiwaukee Prairie State Natural Area. And in the southern portion of the Chiwaukee Prairie State Natural Area, a developer, J.H. Penney and Sons, had planned again, luxury home development that included a golf course and a marina and parks and a school. Neither of these developments came to fruition as a result of the stock market crash in the late 1920s. But the land had been subdivided and platted and individual lots sold, well over 500 lots. And it was looking as if this area would almost certainly be developed. Some of the first houses had been built. And there was an effort to pursue a zoning change to put in a large marina that would have significantly changed the lakeside portion of this region. And local residents got together in part, again, as the result of Al Crampert visiting a friend of his, Phil Sander, and asking, isn't there something we can do to conserve the prairie? In the, wake of potential development here, is there something we can do to preserve this remnant prairie that has so much historic and scientific significance? Phil Sander said, yeah, I think, there are some options. We can either get the state to purchase this area and develop it as a protected lands, or we could work with private partners and purchase it, say, as a nonprofit, and turn it into a private nature preserve or a nonprofit nature preserve. It turned out they worked with the Nature Conservancy. Phil Sanders pictured in the upper right, and Al and Carla Crampert there in the lower left, and a number of other community members, including Jen Crema, to acquire the first parcel of land, which was purchased in partnership with the Nature Conservancy. It was a 1 mile long, 15-acre parcel, so it was only 100 to 300 feet wide. But it was the first acquisition in what would later become Chiwaukee Prairie State Natural Area, which I said had been divided into 500 or so smaller parcels of land. And people like Jen Crema organized events to raise awareness for the prairie. Jen Crema gave numerous talks about the prairie, worked to do fundraising, and that first parcel of land the group purchased for $5,500. That was a loan from the Nature Conservancy, so they worked to raise funds to pay the loan back and to buy additional parcels to bring together a larger contiguous block of habitat in the prairie. So it's because of these local community members that Chiwaukee Prairie really exists as prairie today instead of a developed piece of land. If we think about Chiwaukee Prairie today, it extends from, on the northern end, the city of Kenosha is up here at the north, and we have the Kenosha Dunes area, which is the northernmost parcel. All the way down to, on the southern end, we have the Illinois state line, the Wisconsin-Illinois state line. We have about 490 acres that have been acquired within this area. The majority of it sits south of 116th Street, which is also called Tobin Road, or historically was also called Tobin Road. So this block of contiguous prairie south of 116th Street to the state line is some of the most pristine remnant prairie that we have left in the state. It has a lot of biological significance. There are over 450 species of plants found in these 490 acres. Birders have seen over 200 species of birds at some point during the year, and we think about 80 or so nest within the borders of the prairie. It was declared a Wisconsin State Natural Area in 1967. After enough parcels had been acquired by the Nature Conservancy and these community partners to put together a significant piece of land. It was recognized as a national natural landmark by the Park Service in 1973. On November 7th, 1973, we're coming up on the 50th anniversary in just a few weeks of that designation. And it has been recognized as a part of a larger parcel of land, the Chiwaukee Prairie, Illinois Beach Lake Plain, that's been declared a Ramsar wetland of international importance. And the Ramsar wetlands of international importance result from a treaty that was put together by many countries, happened to be meeting in Ramsar, Iran, which is where the treaty name came from. So the Ramsar wetland designation comes from this international treaty among countries that occurred in Ramsar, Iran, and it allows countries to designate significant wetlands as not just nationally important sites, but internationally important sites. And that's important to a lot of migratory species that cross borders. So when we think about those wetlands of international importance, we'll talk about their significance to some species that cross borders in a little bit. If we look at Chiwaukee Prairie, you know, the name can be somewhat misleading. Historically, prairies have meant grassland areas. The term actually comes from the French term for meadow. And when French explorers first came to North America, they named a number of the open grassland areas prairies because they didn't have any other terminology for it. But within this block of habitat that is the Chiwaukee Prairie State Natural Area, we actually have quite a mix of different kinds of biological communities. They tend to be a little bit on the wetter side, but because they're right along the shore of Lake Michigan, as the shore has advanced and retreated over the years, given the glacial history of Wisconsin and Lake Michigan, there are some higher areas and lower areas, what we call swells and ridges, or swales and ridges. And that ridge swale topography creates a diversity of habitats within the prairie where there are wet areas and there are drier areas. So we have a mixture of wet prairie and sort of medium wet prairie that we call mesic prairie or wet to mesic prairie. And we also have some other kinds of interesting biological communities in the prairie. Here we're looking north from what would be 122nd Street, one of the first roads that was actually built to provide access to that development, Chiwaukee on the Lake, but has now been abandoned. So you can still see some curbs and things, but not much of the road other than that at this point. But we're looking north into what is called an oak opening, and oak openings, or oak savanna, they're sometimes called, are one of those rare plant communities like the prairie communities in Wisconsin that were heavily developed, and we have very few good examples of left. So within Chiwaukee Prairie State Natural Area, we have oak savannas, we have wet prairie, we have drier prairie, we have some areas that are called calcareous fens because they're fed by underwater streams that bring calcium-rich deposits into the soils. And we have organisms that are found uniquely in those fen areas. So there's quite a diversity of habitats. Again, just part of the visual field trip here. Here's a scene in the fall, eastern tiger swallowtail butterfly visiting some of the blazing stars that are out at that point in time. Here are some wetlands. This is more of a wetland pond in the prairie, but we have those ridges and swales, just a small number of feet in elevation change. You can see wetter areas and drier areas within the prairie. Here's a little wet depression, and within that wet depression, you can see blue flags, the flowers, which are a native iris species. And here's a close-up of a flag weevil on one of those blue flag plants. Interesting, these were studied by a biologist, for those of you down in Lake County, a biologist from Lake Forest College. Back in the early 1900s, he studied the blue flag weevils in the local plant communities in northern Illinois and southern Wisconsin. But as the name implies, the blue flag weevil, it has an intimate association with blue flag, and it completes all of the stages of its development on the blue flag plants. Now we'll see in those names, when we think about naming, the wet characteristic of Chiwaukee Prairie and a lot of the species that are found there. So as we continue our visual tour of the prairie here, we'll start with some of the wetland species that we find in the prairie. This is the eastern pond hawk dragonfly. So again, that pond hawk we recognize as a species that has an association with wetter areas, and they complete part of their life cycle development, the juvenile stages of the dragonflies in wet areas. Here's a marsh marigold early in the spring. This is one of the first things to flower in Chiwaukee Prairie. And at that time of the year, it's still subject to late frosts. And fortunately, it's very hardy to those frost-like conditions. So here was marsh marigolds on a frosty morning in Chiwaukee Prairie. Some of the first things to flower in the spring. But again, the marsh marigold tells us where these plants are found in the wetter areas of the prairie. Here's a marsh wren. And marsh wrens are also known to be common in the wetter areas, frequenting marshes. This is a characteristic stance for the marsh wren, where it sort of has its feet splayed on two different twigs in the underlying sedges and vegetation that they encounter in the marshes. And some of the more common species that we might see, this is a red-winged blackbird, also often found in those wetter areas of the prairie. We think of the prairie, so we've looked at a couple of birds now. When we think about the birds, we think of the prairie as kind of an incubator for wildlife in many ways. So this is, again, a not so uncommon species. This is a robin. But the prairie is an important nesting area for species that are found here and breed in the prairie, or even migrate to the prairie to breed. And as these little robins hatch, they are eager to feed. They let their parents know that they need to be fed. And the rich diversity of insects that are found in the prairie makes the prairie a great place to raise little bird young. It's not just the familiar birds that we see in the prairie, but we see a lot of unfamiliar, less common or threatened and endangered species in the prairie as well. This is a threatened species in the state of Wisconsin, the woodcock. And you can maybe see that the woodcock is very good at blending in with its background. This is a female woodcock on a nest, and they nest on the ground. You wouldn't really be able to tell there was a nest there unless you disturbed the bird, because the birds sit on the nest and blend in very well with the mottled background. And the eggs, if she does leave the nest when you disturb it by accident, are also that mottled coloration and blend in with the background really well. But just a small little scrape on the ground, they nest there, and pretty quickly after the birds hatch, they are up and about and following mom around to feed in the prairies. We have species that migrate to the prairie to breed. So here would be a spotted sandpiper, and they actually don't breed in Chiwaukee Prairie itself, but they breed around Chiwaukee Prairie. We occasionally see them in the wetter areas, not actually breeding, but visiting, sometimes on the migration or times near the nesting breeding season. They migrate from pretty good distances away. And sometimes we see species that are only found here during the migration. They might not breed anywhere near the prairie. So here's a sanderling over on the shore of Lake Michigan, just a short distance away from some of the protected areas in the prairie. And sanderlings can migrate 6,000 miles between their breeding grounds and their overwintering areas. And we only see them passing through. They don't stay here to breed. They breed up in the northern Arctic areas, and then they fly back south, maybe only to the eastern coast of the United States, but sometimes all the way down into South America. This is a willow flycatcher. Again, sometimes we learn about the habitats from the names. They're found in the shrubbier areas in the prairie. We have a mix of grasses and low vegetation that we call forbs, sometimes some woody shrubby plants, but grassland or prairies are defined as less than 1 tree per acre in terms of habitat. So when we think of prairies, we think of them as lower vegetation, although I tell my students, be prepared that lower vegetation can be over your head sometimes. We don't usually see trees in the prairie, but some of those grasses can be 6 feet or 7 feet or 8 feet tall. So it can be quite dense. Here's a willow flycatcher, one of the residents of the shrubbier areas in the prairie, and behind it, the blue flowers that we've seen a few times now are Ohio spiderwort. They bloom from relatively early in the summer through the end of summer. They're quite common in Chiwaukee Prairie. There's another resident of those shrubbier areas, the common yellowthroat, and it is common. But we don't think of it as common at our feeders because they're not really a feeder bird. They're found in the shrubby understory areas. And if you get down in the shrubs with them, you see common yellowthroats quite a bit, but takes a little work to get out into the brush to see the yellowthroats. We also have eastern bluebirds in Chiwaukee Prairie, and I'll say a little bit more about those in terms of conservation efforts when we think about the people that work to preserve the prairie. Eastern bluebirds have declined in populations in the United States, at least in part due to the introduction of non-native bird species that compete with them for nesting sites. Bluebirds nest in natural tree cavities, and after species like house sparrows were introduced, the European house sparrow, that also nest in cavities, the opportunities for nesting for bluebirds have decreased. And some of the conservation work in the prairie has involved protecting some nesting space for the bluebirds. You'll see that a little bit later. We'll stick with blue for a little bit. These are and shift over our attention on this little visual field trip to look at lupins. These are a native species in the prairie, and they're quite dense in some areas. They're not uncommon. They're a common species. They're host to a number of insect visitors, some that feed on the lupins as caterpillars, and some, for example, for juvenile stages of butterflies and moths, and some that visit as pollinators. Here we have a honeybee visiting those flowers of the lupin plant. As a species, we see fairly common early summer in the prairie, the lupins. Here's a species that's a little more unique to the prairie. We see lupins a little bit more broadly distributed, but then we see some species that are more narrowly distributed. This is a fall species called the downy gentian or prairie gentian, again named for where it's found. And we have another variety of bee. This is a sweat bee that is visiting the prairie gentian, and we'll see more gentians a little bit later in the talk as well. There are 4 species of gentians in the prairie. Again, another species named for the habitat where it's found. The plant in this photo is Fengrassa parnassus, and it's not a grass. I mean, some of the things about these photos can be deceiving sometimes. It's not a grass, despite the naming. It's a species of flowering plant that we think of as, more of a forb or a low kind of plant, non-woody plant. When we look at the flower itself, the lines that we see in the petals of those flowers guide insects that visit the flower right to the nectar at the base of the flower. And we can see the brown structures are the anthers that contain pollen. So the goal of the plant in guiding the visitors to the nectar is to get them to pass by the pollen and brush up against those anthers and get pollen on their bodies, so that when they visit another flower, they carry that pollen away and end up pollinating a different individual of the same species, ideally. A lot of plants have a number of adaptations that encourage repeat visits of pollinators to the same kind of plant to increase their pollination success. And these lines that we see in the petals are one way to speed the efficiency of pollinators visiting and getting nectar rewards in the flower. So it's a way for the plants to help pollinators be more efficient and visit more plants per unit time. And maybe once they learn how to handle a plant like the fengrass of Parnassus, to make repeated visits to the fengrass of Parnassus. Some of the deceptions, I want to go back there. Some of the deception we see in this image, these bright yellow dots sort of look like a crown in the center of the flower. You could think those were anthers with pollen as well, and it might serve that way as a visual attractant to potential pollinators, but those are actually non-reproductive structures that the plant has adapted to serve as more ways of getting attention, sort of a visual aid to get the attention of pollinators. But that's not actually where the pollen is produced. The visitor in this photo is a fly, and this is a broad-headed marsh fly. So again, continuing with our naming, we can imagine where these are found. We have a fengrass of Parnassus plant and a marsh fly, and these are indeed found in the wetter areas of the prairie, and particularly in those calcareous fens, or the areas where groundwater bubbles up through bedrock or glacial deposits that contains calcium and creates calcium-enriched soils. Fengrass of Parnassus is very narrow in its distribution. It's only found in those fen areas where it has calcium-enriched soil. And this broad-headed marsh fly is a common resident of those wetter areas. And it is a fly, even though we don't see the wings. This photo was shot at 1/800th of a second in terms of the shutter speed. And even so, the wings are beating so fast that they get blurred out. You don't even see the wings in the photo. But it does have wings, trust me, it has wings. And they're frequent visitors as pollinators of these flies. Here's some related fly visitors, this time in those Ohio spiderwort plants that I mentioned. You can see the bright yellow pollen on the anthers of the Ohio spiderwort. This is a margined calligrapher fly. Again, sometimes people think these, like the marsh fly, are bees given their yellow and black striped coloration. And that's again deception. It probably confers a little bit of protection to the flies by looking like bees. They get left alone by some potential predators. And yet they're not bees. They don't have stings. They're not protected in any way. That's just coloration that again serves to deceive other individuals. Eastern tiger swallowtail I mentioned earlier. It's a kind of an insect, the butterflies, with scales on its wings that give it a rich color pattern. And we see a lot of butterflies in Chiwaukee Prairie. This one happens to be visiting a blazing star in August. Here's another visitor to a blazing star, and you certainly would be excused for thinking it's a monarch butterfly. It has the coloration pattern of a monarch butterfly, but it's another example of deception. These are viceroy butterflies, and they benefit from looking like monarchs because the monarchs have chemical defenses that protect them from predation by birds. And the viceroys benefit by looking like monarchs. It gives them some protection against predation by birds, but they don't have the same kind of chemical compounds in them that the monarchs store up in their own bodies from the plants they feed on. Here's a monarch on one of those plants it feeds on as a caterpillar. This is an adult monarch feeding on flowers of common milkweed in the prairie. And the defenses come from the plants they eat the leaves of as caterpillars, and then they carry those defenses over into the adult butterflies. But again, black and white coloration, just to notice the difference between monarchs and viceroys. The viceroys, if I go back, go back, have a black line that goes across the hind wing, and the monarchs don't have that black line that crosses the hind wing. So now you can be experts in distinguishing monarchs from viceroys the next time you see an orange and black and white butterfly flying by. Milkweeds are quite common in the prairie, and they're an important source of nectar and pollen for a lot of insects, and a lot of insects feed on them. like those juvenile stages of monarch butterflies. Here we have some milkweed bugs. These are true bugs. And a bug is an insect with piercing and sucking mouth parts. You can sort of see the piercing and sucking mouth parts here. These are juveniles. So unlike the juveniles of butterflies that are caterpillar-like and look completely different from the adults, these look like smaller versions of the adult bugs. But so far we've seen monarchs which feed on milkweeds, and a milkweed beetle in the very first slide, and a milkweed bug here. There's quite a community of insects that make milkweeds their home, and they spend most of their development on the milkweed plant. And we have several different varieties of milkweeds in Chiwaukee Prairie. Here's a swamp milkweed, again with the names, found in the wetter areas of the prairie, and an eyed brown butterfly. And the eyed brown butterfly feeds on sedges in the wetter areas of the prairie, the sedge meadows, which is another kind of biological community we have in Chiwaukee Prairie State Natural Area. So the caterpillars of the eyed brown feed on the sedges, and then the adults emerge and fly around, and they might feed in those wetter areas on plants like the swamp milkweed. We also have green milkweeds in the prairie. So you can see the green flowers even on the green milkweed. And we have ones that maybe you have in your garden, the butterfly weeds that, like those native plants in the prairie, attract a lot of butterflies. The butterfly weed attracts a lot of insect visitors, including ants and aphids and butterflies and other kinds of insects. But you can see just from these photos, the diversity. We have 8 species of milkweed in Chiwaukee Prairie. These are seeds of the common milkweed, well adapted for broad dispersal. So we sometimes think of them as weeds when they grow up in our yard, but I'd actually encourage you to let the milkweeds grow. They're an important food plant for a lot of native insects. And that's one of the themes in terms of ways that we can help promote conservation of nature, thinking about our own landscaping in our yards and the plants that we allow to persist in our home environments can be an important conservation strategy. But, encouraging the success of these native plants in their natural habitats is important as well. And there's quite a bit of work that goes into the prairie in protecting those natural habitats to start, partially by conserving land, but then managing those natural habitats to keep invasive species out and some of the threats associated with human activities, like invasive species and climate change, at bay so that those native species can thrive. We'll talk a little bit more about that in just a few minutes. Again, just some more photos, pretty pictures of insects and plants in the prairie. This is a soldier beetle on cowbane in Chiwaukee Prairie. This is a goldenrod soldier beetle. And this time it's on its namesake, the goldenrod. But again, if you look at the body of that goldenrod soldier beetle, you can see all of the little pollen grains that come from visiting plants. And this is quite an active, it visits many species of plants as a pollinator in the fall. They're quite common late summer, early fall in the prairie, and they are quite effective pollinators. There's a Baltimore checker spot butterfly, one of our rarer species of insects, Chiwaukee Prairie. And in the visual tour here, a few more of our common species of plants at different times of the year. We have a lot of black-eyed Susans, which are part of what we're seeing here, the yellow and brown black plants in this photo, flowering plants in the photo, and quite a few prairie clovers, which are the purple flowering plants seen in this photo. Here's a bumblebee visiting one of those purple prairie clovers. Again, part of the work to conserve insect species is conserving the plants that they're associated with. And sometimes part of the work of conserving the plants is preserving their pollinators. Some very intimate associations between plants and insects and plants and other kinds of pollinators. We have those Ohio spiderworts visible in this photo, the blue triangular flowers, but we also have Indian paintbrush. Indian paintbrush, in terms of natural history, is a really interesting plant. It's a hemiparasite, meaning it grows its roots into the root systems of nearby plants, and it gets some of its energy from tapping into the nutrients that are, or the food, the sugary compounds made by nearby plants. Here are some of those blazing stars and rosinweed as we progress towards the fall in Chiwaukee Prairie. The rosinweed are the yellow flowers, and we have a few different varieties of blazing stars that flower in succession in late summer, early fall in the prairie. There's more blazing star. And let me jump ahead here to some of the wetter residents again, just to show you some of the other organisms that are present. We have leopard frogs. We have green frogs. And we do have a few vertebrates in the prairie, not to ignore those. Most people, when they look at this, notice the muskrat. So muskrats are mammals, and they're found in the wetter areas of the prairie. I notice those little green flecks that are on the muskrat's face, as someone who thinks more about plants and insects. Those are some of the smallest flowering plants in the world. Each one of those little green specks, pondweed, duckweed, is actually an individual plant, complete with roots and leaves and flowers. So in those wetter areas, we have great blue herons. We have great egrets, and the great egret, I think, is a great conservation story. So I will pause for a minute or two and tell a little bit more about egrets. Egrets in this country were hunted to near extinction back in the late 1800s into the early 1900s. And in fact, many of our bird species were overhunted, some to extinction and some to the verge of extinction. But the case of the egrets is interesting because they were, in some ways, one of the turning points, the birth of our modern environmental movement. At that time, it was quite common for women to wear feathers in their clothing and on hats in particular. And there was quite an industry that grew up around hat making and the millinery trade. In the late 1800s, Frank Chapman, an ornithologist, someone who studies birds, talked about going on a birding expedition in New York City in a shopping district and identified over 40 species of birds on hats, on women's hats. It was such a big trade that millions of, in particular, egrets, like that great egret in the last photo, were slaughtered for hat making. And egret feathers, ounce for ounce, were worth more than gold. They were that valuable a commodity because of the demand for them. And that fueled a couple of women to get together in their living room in Boston over tea and talk about what could be done to protect and conserve bird species. That led to subsequent tea parties where they convinced 900 of their friends to boycott hats with feathers. And it founded the Massachusetts Audubon Society, a local chapter devoted to bird conservation. And it turned out many other states sort of followed suit. And that gave rise, through these local organizations of individuals concerned about conservation, to the National Audubon Society, a bird conservation organization. And some of the work that the National Audubon Society did was to organize around legislation to protect birds, in part from their overuse as part of the hat making industry. But in general, to protect birds from overhunting, overharvesting. And the Migratory Bird Treaty Act in the early 1900s in the United States was a direct result of people getting organized to conserve birds And the National Audubon Society was a big driver in the development of the Migratory Bird Treaty Act in the United States. Audubon, recognizing this little bit of history associated with egrets and hats and the organization of those women, Harriet Hemingway and Minna Hall over tea, uses an image like this one of an egret in flight as its logo for the National Audubon Organization. We have egrets in Wisconsin, and they have recovered from those days when their populations were low, but they're still considered a threatened species in the state of Wisconsin. They're still rare here. These two are not rare. These are sandhill cranes, and in some ways we think of them as emblematic of the state of Wisconsin. In the spring, in the summer, you can hear those cranes from a mile away, seems like. And it's interesting that back in the early part of the 1900s, up until 1930, sandhill cranes were very rare in the state of Wisconsin. It's estimated that in 1930, there were as few as 15 breeding pairs. Aldo Leopold, a Wisconsin conservationist, estimated only 5 breeding pairs at one point in the state. And now, as a result of those protections afforded to birds from the Migratory Bird Treaty Act and other conservation efforts, the International Crane Foundation in Baraboo, Wisconsin, does an annual crane count. And in 2022, they counted over 13,000 cranes in the state of Wisconsin. And we know the population is much higher than that. But these birds have recovered nicely as a result of the protections from organizations that promoted conservation efforts like the National Audubon Society. I mentioned Aldo Leopold. He was an important Wisconsin conservation figure, best known for his writings about a land ethic, where he says, you know, a thing is right if it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the natural environment, and it's wrong if it tends to do otherwise. And he was eager to see sandhill cranes come back to his property in Baraboo, Wisconsin. He was a professor of wildlife science at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And he founded essentially a weekend home, which he went to work on converting an old farm back into natural prairie in hopes that that restoration effort would bring species back, like the sandhill cranes. He said the first rule of intelligent tinkering is to keep all the parts, and those conservation efforts that he engaged in were really focused on how do we keep that natural integrity of biological communities together. And one part of that is trying to keep all the pieces. So if species are rare, we need to work to conserve them. And that was a guiding theme that he focused a lot of his attention on. And subsequently, the field of conservation biology focuses on preserving rare species. But that consistent focus on identifying the factors that lead to decline of native populations and working to counteract those to protect species, to bring them back from the verge of extinction, is really what conservation biology is about. And it's paid dividends in the case of sandhill cranes, and it's an ongoing effort for many other species. I wanted to show you just a few of the rare and endangered species that we find in Chiwaukee Prairie. These are eastern white fringe prairie orchids. They are endangered in the state of Wisconsin and federally endangered, are actually federally threatened. We grade things in terms of their conservation needs from least concern, they're abundant, to species of concern, species that are threatened, meaning their populations are declining and they're on the verge of becoming endangered, endangered being the most rare, and then ultimately species that go extinct and we don't find anywhere anymore, like the passenger pigeons. In any case, eastern white fringe prairie orchids are one of those species that in the state of Wisconsin, they're in that most endangered category, endangered, and nationwide, they're threatened. They're a species that's been significantly declining, in part because of their narrow habitat preferences, the areas where they live. They're found only in prairies. I think I forgot to mention at the beginning of the talk, one of the reasons conserving areas like Chiwaukee Prairie is really important is we have less than half of 1% of the area that used to be prairie in the state of Wisconsin left. And a lot of that prairie is fragmented into small little parcels. Along with that, a lot of the species that are endemic to the prairie, found only in the prairies, have been in decline or have gone extinct. So eastern white fringe prairie orchids are one of those species. They're only found in the prairies. And as prairies have declined, the orchids have declined. But you can see the beauty of the orchid. Again, thinking about the intimate species associations, each one of these tubes that comes off the back of the flowers, these are the spurs of the flower. The nectar is found way down at the base, and only certain species of insects with really long tongues are able to access those nectar rewards and effectively pollinate the species of orchid. This is a grass pink orchid species. I took this photo back in 2020 and sent it to the DNR because people had recognized there were grass pinks in Chiwaukee Prairie. And the question was, which species of grass pink did we have? There are two different species that we thought they might be. And the rare plant biologist for the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources wrote back and said, this is excellent. This is the Oklahoma grass pink orchid, which we had thought had been extirpated, meaning it had gone extinct in the state of Wisconsin, other than one rare population that was reintroduced. So he was very excited to find that this species that we had thought had been lost from Wisconsin continues to exist in Chiwaukee Prairie. Smooth phlox, another threatened species in the state of Wisconsin. This one is endangered in the state. This is, I'm going to kind of go fast here because I want to get to the conservation efforts that are going on. False asphodel, and you see the ants walking around on these flowers. This is another rare species in Chiwaukee Prairie. And its Latin name ends with the part glutinosa, reflecting that it is sticky false asphodel. It's glutinous, it's sugary secretions. And it turns out that it probably uses those sugary secretions to trap little insects the size of, say, fruit flies on its stem. And we find these plants as carnivorous plants in Chiwaukee Prairie and elsewhere. One of their strategies for living in wetter areas where the soils might be a little bit nutrient poor is to actually make use of insect visitors as food for itself. So it traps those little insects on its stem with its sticky secretions, releases digestive enzymes, and then absorbs the nutrients back across the stem. So pretty cool strategy, but a rare plant nonetheless. This is pale false foxglove, another endangered species in the prairie, in Chiwaukee Prairie. This one is not endangered. This is fringe gentian. This is the greater fringe gentian, but there's a lesser fringe gentian, which is endangered in the prairie. I want to talk about the work that goes on to preserve both of those common species and the less common, the endangered species, the rarer species, because it's really ongoing effort that's required once you acquire a piece of habitat to continue to ensure that all the parts are kept together, thinking about Aldo Leopold's legacy of conservation. So there are a number of organizations that play important roles in conserving rare species in Chiwaukee Prairie. Some of that work is done by professionals, and some of that work's done by volunteers. The Chiwaukee Prairie Preservation Fund, which I happen to be a board member of, sponsors a monthly work day at Chiwaukee Prairie where it engages sometimes as many as 20 volunteers on a weekend to come out and do some of this work of conserving rare species by helping to control invasives, by helping to clear brush in the prairies and keep them from successing into a forested habitat. So we have volunteers and organizations like the Chiwaukee Prairie State or Preservation Fund, and we have professionals like members of the Department of Natural Resources conservation teams. Here's a Department of Natural Resources wildlife ecologist participating in a controlled burn of the prairie. Historically, prairies were kept open as low-lying vegetation areas free from trees, in part by frequent fire. And it turns out fire is a very important conservation tool. The species of the prairie are adapted to it, and the non-native species aren't. And by regular burning, we can keep the woody species out, we can keep the populations of invasive species down, and we can help return nutrients to the soil for the native fire-adapted prairie species. So in a controlled burn, there's a fire break that's set up so the fire doesn't get out of control, and the burn people go through and set fire to the prairie. And here you can see a section of the prairie burning and the black soil that's left behind. And here's that same burn area just 3.5 weeks later. These are all native species of plants that have come back following that fire. They're just fine. And the fire has removed a number of the non-native species. Here's some clear cutting. You know, one of the problems we have in the prairie is the growth of woody species, and particularly invasive species like buckthorn. And here is an area where buckthorn had been removed. You can see the standing stumps there. Typically, we go through and cut the brush and sometimes treat that with specific herbicide just on those cut stems. And here's a species of orchid that is growing up in what had been a buckthorn thicket that would have otherwise crowded it out and taken away its habitat. There's been a lot of conservation effort focused on animals as well, particularly of note, Blanding's turtles. And we share some of this work in common with our friends to the south in Lake County. So some of the turtle work is organized out of the Lake County Forest Protection District. And Gary Glowacki and his colleagues have been doing conservation work on Blanding's turtles that were rare in the state of Wisconsin and even rarer in Illinois, to identify the reasons for their rarity, to track individual turtles, to work with wildlife technicians over the summer to follow individual turtles and see what parts of the community they are using, and to engage in conservation efforts to, keep predator populations low by trapping sometimes aggressive predators of the turtles, by head starting the turtles and growing them in captivity until they get large enough to be safe from predators, and then re-releasing them back into the natural communities. So here's one of those Blanding's turtles that Gary and one of his technicians had found in the prairie one day, and turned out hadn't been seen in over 8 years, had originally been caught and tagged 8 years before that. And they follow the health of these turtles in the prairie and work to conserve Blanding's turtles. I mentioned bluebird conservation earlier, and we're almost finishing up here in terms of conservation efforts. But here's a volunteer, John Krerowitz, works with the Hoy Audubon Society, a local Audubon society. And these are bluebird nest boxes, which have been put into the prairie. I mentioned that bluebirds, one of their conservation challenges is loss of natural cavities to nest in, primarily due to competition with non-native species like house sparrows. House sparrows were introduced to the United States by someone who thought it'd be a great idea to bring all of the birds that were mentioned in Shakespeare's plays from England into the United States. And as a result of that introduction, the house sparrows were strongly competitive. They had fewer predators and things than native species, strongly competitive with native species, and they have in some ways decimated bird populations in the United States. Part of that is competition for nest sites. And with the nest boxes, volunteers will check the nest frequently early in the breeding season. And if they come to be occupied by house sparrows, they'll remove the nests, promoting then nesting by eastern bluebirds. Seen here, here's mom and dad, eastern bluebird, mom with a beetle that she's caught in the prairie to feed her offspring, or by tree swallows. So here's an adult tree swallow visiting one of those nest boxes. And here's a bunch of newly fledged baby tree swallows having a little bit of a sibling spat, it looks like, on the nest box. But again, as a result of these nest box efforts, native species like bluebirds and tree swallows are supported in the prairie habitats. Some work by, again, Chiwaukee Prairie Preservation Fund volunteers, Nathan and Lindy in this case, who are caging some native species to try and prevent deer browsing when those species are first growing in the prairie, trying to, again, protect them from that predation, give them a head start, and allow populations of rarer species to recover. Here's the particular species they were working with, their Penstemon pallidus, pale penstemon species. I'm going to end there, just again highlighting the work of many, many volunteers in conservation. So, if you were interested in conservation, here's two more of our Chiwaukee Prairie Preservation Fund board members, Pam Holy in the foreground and Rick Wadley way up there a little bit farther into the slide, doing a trail clearing, and they mow to open up or to cut down vegetation on the fire breaks, to remove some of those weedy species. But you could volunteer, as a number of these people in the slides are doing. You can grow native plants at home to bolster populations of native plants and the native insects that are dependent on them, and the native bird populations that use insects for bird food. You can support conservation efforts, as the Sierra Club has a long history of doing in terms of legislation and conservation, or you can donate to support some of these organizations. But I'd say the number one thing you can do in terms of promoting conservation efforts is really to feed your own passion for nature, or the passion of others, by spending time in nature. When we think about those early conservation efforts, they were usually inspired by people that spent time in nature, had a deep interest in nature, and recognized the significance of those natural areas when they saw them. So whether we're talking about Al Crampert driving through those fields of shooting stars, or John Muir and the founding of the Sierra Club, or Harriet Hemingway and Minna Hall and the founding of the National Audubon Society, the local Audubon chapters, they were motivated to do that work because they cared about nature. And I think that's the number one thing.
All right.
To feed your own.
I've got them. They're up already.
Curiosity about nature. I think we will end there and take questions, because I know we're about at our hour limit here.
Okay.
So thank you for your attention, and happy to answer questions.
All right. Thank you very much, Dan.
Steve, we can't hear you.
Okay, here we go. I'm sorry. I have to press the button. How often do you burn the prairie, and is there a schedule?
So in theory, there's a schedule. We burn the prairie in sections. because it's important that you have, say for those insects, refugia, areas that haven't been burned for the insect populations to recover from. So typically we try and burn not every year and not the whole prairie in any given year, but a section of the prairie. And roughly it's on a 3-year schedule. But nature interrupts that schedule. And sometimes in terms of scheduling people to get out there and do it, that can be a challenge as well. But the goal is about a 3-year rotation and burn about a third of the prairie each year.
Okay. All right. I have another one. Can you tell us what predators attack turtles?
So the study that I recently mentioned was looking at raccoons. So raccoons, I know, are an important predator. Gary Chiwaukee could tell you a lot more about this. He's the turtle expert. And Lake County has done a lot of work in terms of those turtle preservations. But I know that raccoons are one of the big ones that they're concerned about.
All right. And then the rest are just compliments. Dan says this is an amazing educational program. It should be on PBS. Amazing presentation, Dana. And Carolyn says, agree, Dana is a phenomenal photographer and even better presenter of this valuable information. And let's see, kudos to the photographers. Oh, here's another question from Chris Johnson. Is there a trail through the prairie?
Yeah, so this was something Linda and I talked about at the beginning. I said, let's make sure to ask that question if it doesn't come up. She asked, how do you get there from northern Illinois? And the best way into the prairie in terms of accessible sites in the prairie is to at least that contiguous block of prairie between 116th Street and the state line is to come up Sheridan Road and turn east off of Sheridan Road on 116th Street when you get into Kenosha County. Drive almost all the way to the lake, and 1 block short of the lake, turn on, it's called First Court, and go down a block and then turn, I say a block, it's 1 road, but the road is actually 121st Street. So when you get to 121st Street, you can turn back west towards Sheridan Road or towards, you'll see the railroad tracks over there to the west. And there's a small little parking area and there's a porta potty there. You know you've arrived when you find the porta potty. And there are a number of paths that have been named from or named after some of those individuals that were important in the early conservation efforts in the prairie. They are small paths and they're not always well mowed. So you have to be prepared to get out in the brush a little bit and hunt your way through the vegetation sometimes. But there is the Al Crampert Trail and the Phil Sander Trail and the Jen Crema Trail. They make a loop essentially from that area of 121st Street down to 122nd Street through the prairie. But Chiwaukee Prairie is part of the state natural area system, and state natural areas are managed differently from state parks and state recreation areas. State parks and state recreation areas encourage a lot of human activity. State natural areas encourage a lot of conservation of native plants and animals, and there are relatively fewer trails and roads into those areas. So there are only a few trails. But
all right. Well, that's all I have for questions. Number of thank yous.
Well, I guess
someone said the directions are on the website.
They are.
Okay.
Yep.
Well, I want to thank you again, and just absolutely so delighted that you joined us. We will be sending out the address if I think some of us want to watch this again. And is there, can we capture that map to put on the email I send out? Well, anyways, I don't know if if a Sierra Club campfire would let me drop it on there. But maybe you can you send me the address for the website, and I can put that on for sure, Dana.
Yep. I'll send you a link to the website that has a link to the map. And
then I can put that on the thank you for coming tonight. We are absolutely so grateful. Your pictures are beautiful. Your presentation was wonderful, and we're so grateful for you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And thank everyone for attending our Sunday speaker series for October tonight. We have one more program this year. On Sunday, November 19th, we will welcome Dr. Mila Marshall of the Illinois Sierra Club. Mila will explain the significance of those forever chemicals. Don't miss the opportunity to learn the consequences of PFAS and other chemicals that are pervasive in our world today. Watch the Woods and Wetlands newsletter for upcoming events, for dates and times. Be sure to register for our Sunday speaker series in November. We'll be looking for you. And Dana, I will be sending you a surprise shortly. Good night, everyone. Thank you for joining us. And
all right. Thanks, everyone. Great being here.
And thanks to Lake County